how do you incorporate historically significant architecture? In the case of the Miracle Mile, Art Deco, streamlined, modern. How do they obviously just can't be preserved like museum pieces. They were built and conceived as dynamic places, whether they were taverns, restaurants, retailing, theaters, department stores. So I guess the issue is then about readapting them. How do we make these Art Deco treasures we have relate to the Miracle Mile today? And this is why it's good to talk about the Academy Museum, because that's the largest readaptation project
for the May Company
we've got going.
in the area. Although I think your question is almost timeless because it gets back to the issue of what is Miracle Mile. So it started out as a commercial destination, or at least that was the idea that Ross had. Grew as a residential area as well. And then, as you said, as long as you've been living here, it was really unclear whether it was a destination or just a commercial area that sort of served the needs of the residents here. And I think you're tending towards the latter, that in some ways it served the needs of the residents, in other ways it hasn't and didn't. Hasn't now, and then a locus for some cultural institutions, thank goodness for LACMA in essence. So there's going to be another large cultural institution moving in with a lot of programming, and it will become a destination at least some of the time, and there may be, evening bashes and, famous people coming and the ripple effect of famous people, everybody else who wants to be seen with famous people. And yet it is also a residential area that I think prides itself on being a residential area and having, this commercial center for what it's worth. So that's not just, it's not just MTA that's going, or Metro that's going to change, I should say, the composition of this end of Miracle Mile. It will be the Academy that will change, and I don't know that it's necessarily going to be embraced by the neighborhood. I don't know how, I don't live here. I might be one of the people coming here just for that destination.
Well, the question would be, if you came here, how are you going to be captured once you are here? Are you going to arrive in your automobile in their parking lot, come up an escalator or an elevator into their building, and never leave the four walls that they've put up?
A likely scenario, I think.
If that's the case, then I would say that the ripple effect will only be traffic, more congestion, and a feeling in the neighborhood of deepening resentment and a hardening of positions, where the next one who comes along is going to have an even bigger fight on their hands than the previous proposal. And so if that's the scenario, I'm afraid it doesn't spin out well for either the Miracle Mile or the city at large. There has to be a different formula. Now, I'm not in the city planning department, and I'm certainly not the design director of LA, but...
But isn't it what happened with the Grove, too? I mean, always, it has been for a long time, that area, a destination because of the farmers market, but as the Grove became the Grove, it is a destination, but a lot of people drive. Although there are quite a few residential areas around, there's still a lot of people drive.
Yeah, I mean, the Grove had a disastrous impact on traffic, particularly if you're on Fairfax or you're on 3rd Street.
3rd, yeah.
And it's walled off on all sides. It's walled off from a park that's right next door.
Yes.
It's walled off from 3rd Street. Unless you know something I don't know, there's no way to get in there. The only way you really get in is either through Nordstrom's at one end or through the remainder of what's the street that's going through right there, Ogden, I think.
Ogden, or through Farmers Market, which
right.
Actually is in its own way walled off too. I don't
right.
think it was that way, but yeah.
More now than
more
it
now.
was before, but and that's intentional. That's by design. And it's permissible. in the city, and something similar will no doubt happen with the Academy Theater, and for that matter with LACMA, because they look at it the exact same way that A.W. Ross looked at it. If somebody's coming, they're coming to my store and they're spending their money in my location, because I've got capital investment here, and I don't intend to see that capital investment wither away. I want to see it grow. And I think that's a fundamental problem, not with the idea that the Academy is coming here and programming. It's with the way in which the city handles how they structure the rights that are conferred on them when they do the adaptive reuse of the May Company building, and then they add on the theater on the backside. Because if they were forbidden from building their own cafe, and they were forbidden from building parking, watch out, Jim Sullivan's going to kill me for saying that, forbidden from building parking, if they were forced in a way to create a place that pushed people outside of their four walls, to some extent, you might have the texture of things might look very different. I mean, the reason, I can't tell you exactly why. I mean, if you look at 3rd Street from Fairfax to La Cienega, it's kind of experienced a boom over the last decade. Mm-hmm. And to some extent, so has Beverly Boulevard, kind of around Martel. Mm-hmm. And I think it's largely because all of those are very small. They're small buildings with small storefronts. You could start a business in, whatever, how many square feet, 500 or 600 square feet. Maybe it's a little bigger than that. Maybe it's 1,200 square feet. And you could grow from that. And the footprint was never too big. The scale was right. If somebody parked, they could walk. You could encounter other things along the way. And there wasn't this sense of some enormous meteorite that had just landed at some corner. And I think that's the trouble with the way in which development happens in LA. It's not that the idea is a bad one. I think it would be nice if we had an actual Cineplex, or Cinematheque, I should say, a real one, an active one in this neighborhood. Mm-hmm. We need it. But it's the way that it is woven into the fabric of a neighborhood and a city that matters much more in the end than whether the building's a good one or a bad one, although we'd prefer a good one.
Do you think that's the trouble with Miracle Mile, is that the commercial spaces here are not really that small?
Yeah, I think it's a big problem. If you look at the buildings, the CalFed building, mm-hmm. Apart from the fact that it's set back from the street, it's activated on the backside with its parking lot. If you look at, it was built originally as a bank building. There was Crocker National Bank was in the corner of space on the Hauser side. And then I'm trying to remember originally what was in the space that faced Maslin, and I don't recall, but for many years it was like,
I think
no, in the building itself. In the CalFed building itself, the mirror space to where the bank was, there may have been another bank there, but then for many years Singapore Airlines was in there, and that was a showroom essentially for the airline. And those spaces can function well within that kind of tower building, but they do nothing for the street. They close down at 5 p.m. and then they become, illuminated living rooms with nobody in them. So they're really kind of disastrous. And I think if you go down the boulevard, unfortunately, it's occupied by a lot of spaces that are sort of at that scale. It's problematic.
West of Hauser, that is very much true.
Yeah, and
on the southern side of Wilshire.
Right, you have the Mutual Benefit Life building right up the block from where we are now. That's no longer called that. I don't know. Is it the Variety building now? Is it
yeah.
I don't even think they're in there, but maybe.
But their logo is still there.
Right,
yeah.
And that, first of all, much like a LACMA, raised up on a plinth. You have to climb stairs from both sides to approach the building. Mm-hmm. with a moat around it. That was the original thing. It's now grassy. They've tried to push by landscaping, they've tried to push it back out to the street, which I think is a favorable development. But it doesn't change the fact that you have these giant pavilions on either side that can really only house a particular kind of business, something like a museum, or much to the regret of Rakovich, who owns that building, a gymnasium that they don't want it, his bankers don't want it, nobody owns the building wants that.
But it's there.
It's there, and they can't find another tenant to replace it with. You have to walk from the sidewalk into a business. You have to walk from the sidewalk into a little grocery store. I mean, just look, I'll give you another, Santa Monica Boulevard around Fairfax, where there's a large Russian community. It's dotted with these tiny little businesses.
Russian stores, yeah.
Yeah, and
I
they
go
all
and buy food there sometimes.
Yeah, I do too. And you want halva, you go there. And the nutty thing is, if you stand in those stores, you think, golly, what's keeping the doors open here? But it's just enough foot traffic coming up from that neighborhood, which is denser than this, but not significantly denser than this. And the neighborhood uses that stretch. The difficulty for the Miracle Mile is it's out of scale, I think.
For that kind of human consumption. And I don't know if it's possible. And I don't know, I'm going to make a statement, and you may very well disagree because you live here. I don't get the sense that there is enough of, critical power to try and change that. And I realize that there is. You're obviously representatives of that, and you have been involved for years and have very strong and very knowledgeable opinions of ordinances and zoning. And yet something just doesn't quite gel. And perhaps this not gelling is what makes Miracle Mile interesting. That's why we can speculate. That's why the organization gets up in arms when the Peterson Automotive Museum doesn't follow the design guidelines. And I very much sympathize. If I lived here, I'd be very, very upset that there isn't, for example, a plan to make an entrance on Wilshire, where there was one originally, and a very nicely framed entrance. I don't know how long it lasted, since Cebu didn't last that long, but it was an entrance, a street entrance on Wilshire and a street entrance on Fairfax, and neither ones are there. And whenever I go to that museum for an event, I always have to enter through the parking lot, even though I'm a pedestrian. I just insist on walking. It's close enough for me to walk. Always have to enter through the parking lot, and it grates on me. At the same time, Miracle Mile developed specifically for the car, and yes, there was the idea that there would be pedestrian entrances, which is why all of the buildings, certainly between La Brea and Hauser, have pedestrian entrances. And then there would be entrances from the back where the parking lots were. Whereas the Peterson's building was designed at a different age, and yes, it had entrances from the sidewalks, but this kind of post-World War II modernist architecture, at least in LA, was very much about the car and was very much about no pedestrians. I mean, I don't know that pedestrians were taken into account, really. I might be wrong, but the scale of it is so large that you're thinking, yes, I'm just going to drive up and go to the department store. And for as long as I was aware of this building, I did not realize it was by Welton Beckett, but as long as I've been aware of this building, there have been no entrances up front. It's just this blank glass wall. The fact that it's glass doesn't make it any nicer. It's that,
black glass.
Black glass, that's it. And so it would be astounding if I could enter from that area. Just the idea itself, it doesn't compute.
Well, you could when it was Cebu, and then when it was Orbox, which moved out, from the Prudential building. I think, for the post-war modernists like Welton Beckett, who did that building, and then the Prudential building, I think was, is that also Welton Beckett, or who did the?
It's Wardeman and Beckett, yes,
Yeah.
48. Yeah.
Right. That was built with a public plaza facing the
Yes.
boulevard. There was a drugstore there with a soda fountain in it. There were things that presumably were meant to kind of relate to an idea of a civic presence.
Where was that, which one?
The Prudential building.
Prudential.
And I'm
No,
assuming that
Museum Square.
square,
Right,
yeah. And
Museum
I'm
Square.
assuming that when Orbach's was there were probably at least displays in the windows.
There were. There were.
As the store.
Yeah, I remember that well. And what's that?
Same with the makeup.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, the May Company had.
Of course, yeah.
And the May Company was activated from 3 sides. You could enter from Fairfax, if I recall correctly,
Yes.
from Wilshire, and then from the back, which is the addition. And the Broadway, I don't remember it as a Coulter's, although it was Coulter's when we first moved here and became Broadway a little bit after. But that you could enter from either side with the beautiful curved glass, you know. And so I'm not sure that I think it's a little bit later than the post-war. The post-war modernists were, you know, in some ways they were all kind of followers of Victor Gruen, you know, who did believe in this idea that what you're building is a kind of civic place, even if it is automobile oriented. I think it's a little later than that you begin to get a building that's utterly and totally self-contained and nobody except for a car. If they could put the car in the elevator, you could drive it to your desk. That would be their dream come true. And then it would just go right onto the freeway and you would drive 100,000 miles to get to your house and wherever it was going to be. I don't know. I think we face something very difficult in terms of going back to the design overlay, because that's both a vision, which you need to have, and yet it can be a terrible harness or a restraint. And I don't know, what do you do? What do you do when an architect like Renzo Piano comes along and he gives you a total outlier, something that's just has never been contemplated under a design overlay?
Sort of like the stuff that was never built, some of the stuff that was never built.
Yeah, I mean, it's gonna happen, and the best architects are gonna do just as Rem Koolhaas did. You know, the original plan when they invited Koolhaas and Stephen Hull and
Jean Nouvel.
Jean Nouvel, that's right. Also, who else? Morphosis, and then Twin Towers.
Yeah.
Why am I not thinking of this
Is
anyway?
it
Edit that out.
Yamasaki.
No. It's you know, he's the Jewish architect.
We'll put a title on. We'll superimpose the correct.
Anyway, it'll come to me. I don't know why. He always wears cowboy boots.
What was this?
LACMA, the first 5 who were invited when Koolhaas won
The competition.
competition.
but did not- yeah.
Everybody else obeyed the rules. The rules were you're preserving the prior buildings, but you're redoing them. And Koolhaas said,
Screw it, is
Yeah.
what he said.
just get out the bulldozer and the wrecking ball. This has got to go. So you're going to have that from good architects. They're going to be willing to say that, no, your design overlay needs to have these kinds of exceptions. And as you know, as Jim points out, it's problematic because they have the powers that be behind them, whereas a neighborhood association has very little power, and it's always an unequal relationship. And so your only real leverage is to try to enforce this document that may not be a living document. It may not have the means to accommodate something that could be good.
Oh my God, you're so right. And
So what do you do? What do you do? You're in these terribly unequal, because ultimately when you get down to these things, particularly on this stretch of the Miracle Mile, where there are big, big players, the MTA is the only wallet left in the city of LA that has any cash in it. Everybody, as you pointed out, the CRA, gone. Courtesy of Jerry Brown, that's the end of that. The city is basically broke. What other, civic agencies are there with any money? I can't think of any, just the MTA. And then you have LACMA, which has a very peculiar status. It's the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Its operating funds come from the county. They get, I don't know, $38 million a year or something like that. And so they're supposed to be kind of a, public agency, but in fact it's the museum associates, whoever they have morphed into, who run the show in a totally private fashion. They raise money as they wish and seem to spend it as they wish. And so,
but they were not willing to raise money for the Rem Koolhaas.
Well,
or they were, but I mean there were issues. But it was funding.
That's
really.
right. And there was a bond issue that went down that hurt them a lot. And then the museum itself was in transition. That's when Andrea Rich was moving out and Eli Broad was sort of So it went. But what's happening at this end of the Miracle Mile, and to some extent at La Brea too, is the power players are they're not in the mix, they're standing on top of everybody else. And so design overlay, what do they care? The voice of the neighborhood, they're in a position largely to ignore that.
Yes.
And so I think it's a very, very troubling and difficult situation, because the power is not equally shared here, to say the very least. And so when you raise your voice and you say it's a bacon-wrapped department store, and you say it has no entrance on Wilshire Boulevard, you're like the mouse that roared, except for it's not going to work out the way it did in that very humorous novel.
I would like, however, to defend Zumthor's proposal, which I do find interesting. When architects propose these grand proposals, there are always the issues. Some of them are nostalgia, some of them are, as you mentioned, the museum turning itself towards the park, this big blob that kind of parallels the tar pits, perhaps, or maybe not. But I'd like to defend it on a level that where you quoted your colleague, Sam Lobel, and that is the possibility that possibly, if we have an oomph kind of design, which is something that we sometimes wish we had in LA more of, that it might have a ripple effect. I don't know, in fact, but it could. I am fascinated by the idea that Govan expressed in the little movie that's part of the exhibition, and that is the museum being able to display its innards to those on the outside. Being a pedestrian, of course, I can think myself walking towards it and sticking my face into the glass. I don't know if it will be visible to the cars, and again, so much of the transportation is by car, so it may or may not work depending on how far the museum is. But I wanted to throw this idea, we don't necessarily have to discuss it, but just as a sort of the wow effect. I'm still hoping for the wow effect.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, sometimes that's kind of what it takes. I'm curious to know, because you've written a history of this stretch. First, did you have any buildings that when you started looking at this, you do have a nostalgic or a deep lament that they're gone?
I don't have a deep lament, but I do have a kind of a nostalgic thing for the parking lot, which used to be there, I think, where Coulter's and Broadway's. I'm pretty sure that's the one. And it's purely associated with kind of small events in my life. And that is, having my daughter learn how to ride her bicycle there. And it's gone. So there is this piece of real estate, which, in my right mind, I would say, parking lot. Who needs a parking lot? Of course, we need a parking lot. It's nothing. There was something there that I instinctively knew must have been there. Parking lots just don't happen. I just didn't know it was a streamlined modern building. But of course, the nostalgia is, Rebecca learned how to ride her bicycle when she was, a little kid. So there's that. I think what I came to realize eventually is that my interest in Miracle Mile had to do with the contemporary buildings more than with the older buildings. So it was this stretch of Miracle Mile as opposed to the one to the east I regret to say, although the one to the east, I mean, it's so haptic. You feel like you could touch these buildings and, get a piece of sculpture or a piece of neon lighting. Whereas with these buildings here, it's like you said, they're almost faceless, and they're like these sculptures standing on plinths, and then there's, windows, but you have to climb up to them, and they're not gemütlich, as the Germans would say. They're not warm and cuddly, but that's this stretch that was interesting. And I think LACMA had a lot to do with that. And the park and the Tar Pits Museum, the George Page Museum, which I think would be a civic center in essence, and I'm not sure if it functions this way.
And when you say interesting, what do you mean? What captivated you about that?
About the museum or about
this
stretch?
This stretch as opposed to the more deco stretch.
Oh, I think it is probably because it seems to be so different than the other part. Just it's as if like there were like 30 years in between, nothing happened, which is not true. And then this stuff was built. So why did it happen? Why is Hauser Boulevard kind of a break essentially? Mm-hmm. And then there are little things, the flying saucer, that's Office Depot, is that Office Depot?
Yes.
Staples, sorry, yes, the
Yeah.
Staples, right? And then there was a flying saucer restaurant, and I kept thinking to myself, so it looked like a flying saucer, it was a themed piece of architecture. No, I don't think so. It was this,
I don't believe
little
it was.
building with,
Yep.
yeah, and
Gingerbread
it was,
roof
yeah,
or something.
and it was
originally built as a wimpy.
That's
Yeah.
right. And then it became the flying saucer, and now it's this flying saucer.
Well, Ruth, you say something that I think is very important. You taught your daughter to ride her bike in the abandoned parking lot behind the May Company building. You went trespassing there, because although it wasn't hard to trespass, if I recall, you just walk over the little low-hanging chain.
Yes.
But for you, that holds a memory of value and importance. And I think that what we all have a very hard time with, particularly in LA, is knowing how to weigh those experiences so that they sort of fill out the space that we live in so that it becomes something common. I don't mean common by base, I mean common as in shared. Because a sense of place has to arise out of experiences that we all have, to one extent or another, in common. Whether that's just that we walked from John Burroughs Junior High School home every day along Wilshire Boulevard, as I did, or something similar to your daughter. My father rented a Volkswagen Beetle and taught my sister and I how to drive in what was then the parking lot behind the Prudential building, which was closed on the weekends, and it was just a wide open span. He says, you guys have to learn how to drive stick shift. Here's how you're going to do it. We're going around circles inside of this place. So much the way that it used to be, you could kind of do a really nutty thing when there was still the Pan Pacific drive-in movie theater, and the Pan Pacific was there. You could kind of cut through that open, slightly dicey, it was on the edge of things, that space. But all the kids I knew, that's what we did. We traversed this place that you were mildly trespassing. And I feel very strongly that we need those kinds of spaces in order for a neighborhood to really be a neighborhood. And I think that what troubles me is when you fill those places in, the memory disappears because there's no longer, as you say, the haptic or the palpable sensation of it. That's gone. And if what replaces it doesn't invite people in the neighborhood
in a similar kind of, to create those kinds of memories and cultural.
That's right. Then what you get is nothing. That's, I think, what troubles me, because I really worry that it begins at a deeper, not deeper, it begins at a kind of different level, and that is it begins with the schools. Children don't walk to school anymore. Nobody in this neighborhood that I know of sends their child to Carthay Circle Elementary School, although they've changed it to Carthay Center to make it sound as if it's much more important. But nobody sends their kid. There's all kinds of kids in this neighborhood, my child included. None of them go to the neighborhood school, so there isn't even the beginnings of that kind of magnet that would get you to move through the neighborhood, like little iron, tailings moving toward a single spot. It begins there. So the neighborhood has no common sense of this place is important. There's a post office in our neighborhood at Detroit and Wilshire, and to the disgrace of the American public, an institution that once represented the highest standard of good architecture allows its buildings to be pieces of crap. And so who really wants to go to the post office, which is an important civic spot, as we were talking about? Are there civic places along the boulevard?
How about the Starbucks?
The Starbucks. And so
It's at least a destination.
right,
when
it's a
people
destination.
close it.
But it's without disparaging corporate things altogether, it's a cookie cutter. You enter there and it's the same flavor, the same atmosphere, the same everything anytime. And it cannot be like Brown's Bakery on Wilshire was, where as a
People have mentioned it.
well, it wasn't. Truthfully, it wasn't the best.
Not the best, but
Not the best
It was
bakery,
a
because
place-
there are better bakeries. But
it was ours.
it was there, and what, for me as a child going by there, we would stop either there or at the Seas Candy, which was at the corner of Hauser and Wilshire. We'd go there because you could buy a rum cake, soaked in rum, And we didn't even know. We just liked those cakes, which there's no way on earth that the Starbucks will ever have this kind of homemade rum cake thing that they're going to hand to 11-year-old kids, because there's 1,000 rules now that forbid it, and the rent's too high. So it's a long way back to where I began this little speech, and I apologize. But what you say is...
I think we do like to wax nostalgic too in childhood, or these kinds of memories.
But it's more than
provide
that. It's if there isn't a sense of continuity, there's no sense of place. In what way do we belong to any place? Or are we just passing through? Are we just motorists who happen to own a house here or rent here, and we're on a short stop, and we're on to the next thing? And those are two very different things. If you live in a place, then you have to have ways to connect back to it. And part of that is memory. There's nothing wrong with memory.
Yes.
Let's conclude on, we've got the subway coming. It's 9 years, 10 years, 12 years from being completed, but we'll have both a portal both at La Brea and Fairfax. So that's the two gateways to the Miracle Mile. What do you see as the potential upside, and what's the potential downside?
Well, I think the development of subway and rail, at least for the people who live close to it, or for institutions that are close to it, is probably an upside in terms of bringing customers or facilitating circulation. I don't think this means that the car will be abandoned or that the buses will be abandoned. There's, it's sort of like if you build more freeways, there's more traffic. I think the same thing is with public transportation. So there is that upside. And to quote my daughter, who by that time, who knows where she will be if this ever happens, which I'm sure it will. She won't be in college anymore, but now she says, it will be great if the Purple Line came to LACMA, because she has to take different modes of transportation to get to LACMA for her course assignments. Again, by the time it all happens, she will be someplace else. So there is that, but it is going to change the urban fabric, as you eloquently described, of this area. Not for the first time. There were proposals, I think Pereira's proposal, which was, I believe, tied also to public transportation at that time, was to redevelop this corner into the hotels and other kinds of structures, and to redo part of Park La Brea as well, those garden apartments. I mean, I believe it was his proposal, maybe somebody else, was to demolish that and to build something else. So there were all these grandiose ideas for the corner of Wilshire and Fairfax. But with the subway, it will likely happen a different form. So there will be that, and we will be waxing nostalgic for some of these smaller buildings designed by Eisenstadt and others that were here before, and the fact that the residential neighborhoods had that, nicer buffer between them and Wilshire, and they will probably have a canyon between them and Wilshire and more traffic. I'm sure there will be more traffic.
I agree. I mean, I don't know that it'll be necessarily bad. What I think would concern me the most is, what's the level of design?
Yeah.
What are they forced to spend per square foot to build these new buildings? Will they be thoughtfully related as they scale toward 8th Street? It's always hard to say. Those are big fights, really big fights. And will we get anything in exchange for them?
Maybe a little parklet?
Yeah. Or will we get some kind of restoration of the jitneys that were very well used and could help diminish some of at least the local little trips that you take. I'm talking through my hat here. I'm sure there are better ideas than that at least if the development is coming, let's think through the consequences. Let's think them through cumulatively rather than just, we only have to look at this one, not in relationship to the 50 others that we're doing. So I think that those are kind of the large questions. There's no doubt they're coming.
They're coming.
And the question is, are they going to look like Vermont and Wilshire, which I know does have the public art, but and I guess the other example is, are they going to look like Vine or roughly Vine and Hollywood Boulevard around that subway portal, which has been filled into I suppose about as high a density as you could expect out of the W Hotel and the new Trader Joe's there and all of that sort of stuff, and that's a very different area because it created a residential pocket where there was virtually no residential. There's no houses surrounding that area. You have to go across Franklin. It's just nothing nearby. So it's a different context.
And yet it's all hardscape too. And although this small park that's on 8th Street, I don't know to what extent it is used, but it is a park, and occasionally I see people
It actually
jogging.
is really
and
well
there
used.
is a children's playground
Yes.
area, sort of, and
It's
turtles.
privately owned for public use.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that
So-
park is a success, and there isn't always a guarantee that a park will be a success.
No, there isn't.
There's-
That the park would be a success.
Yeah, there's no guarantee that just because you put in a park, it's going to be a
That
success.
people will come. But I would actually hope that whatever those discussions are, and as you've pointed out, it's who has the power and to what extent the neighborhood can wield any kind of pushback, it would be for some greenscape, because as nostalgic as I could become about things that are demolished, it's all hardscape right now. And it is a parking lot too.
Right.
So we'll see.
Okay, we're going to wrap here.
Okay.
Thank you both very much.
I hope we didn't carry on too long.
Great time.
This one